Okay, this is the opening intervention for the Cyber Activism, Social Change, and Social Movements panel. I want to lay out some of the key issues and themes and questions, largely by looking at some of my own recent research and writing on the Occupy movements, and comparing Occupy to the 15M movement in Spain and some of the other movements during the 2011 uprisings. It might help to go back to late 2010, early 2011, when the first salvo in the uprisings of that era began in Tunisia with the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi and the coming together of a movement for economic justice and also for democracy in that country. And soon thereafter, protests spread like wildfire around the Middle East and beyond, perhaps most famously in Tahrir Square in Egypt, where you began to get a protest that shared a lot of the characteristics that later protests in Spain and the US would have. Large numbers of people coming together in public space, organizing that space using self-organization and directly democratic methods, calls for economic justice and political democracy, and significantly the use of social media, particularly at a key early moment, that helped to bring together large numbers of people, but also helped to shape the logic of the movement. In May of 2015, the Indignados movement in Puerto del Sol, and then spreading around Spain, again, focusing on issues of economic justice on the one hand, in particular the 2008 crisis, the bursting of the housing bubble, the unemployment crisis, and the mortgage crisis and the eviction of so many people from their homes, but bringing that together with the long-standing critique of democracy in Spain and the lack of channels for access and participation. Fast forward a few months to September 2011, and you had Occupy Wall Street coming together, taking on many of the same kinds of characteristics, a protest focusing on economic issues, particularly inequality, and the stranglehold that corporate money has over the democratic process in the United States. So bringing together economic issues with, again, a critique of the representative democratic system, in this case in the US, focusing on the kind of monopoly of the two parties and the large moneyed interests. But again, you had some of the same characteristics, large numbers of people coming together in public space, enacting innovative, directly democratic practices, some of those borrowed directly from the Indignados movement, others of them locally homegrown. The emergence of a kind of broad populist category, right? The 99%. The idea that there's an economy that works for the few at the expense of the many, similar to the kind of framework of the Indignados in Spain, a kind of broad populist framework that brings together so many people. And also the role of social media. On the one hand, the role of videos that went viral, sort of showing the repression against the movement and bringing the movement to the public's attention, and the role of social media and getting the word out more generally through peer-to-peer networks. And so in all of these movements, I think there's a lot of similarities, right? Starting from Tunisia and Tahrir in Egypt, running through Spain to the US, and all of the other 2011 movements in between. I think in each of these cases, you had a diversity of social actors, but a prominent role played by young people, in particular, and students who had grown up in the internet age and who were proficient social media users. Also, in all of these movements, you had a combination of economic grievances with calls for greater democracy, right? In some cases in the Middle East, calling for representative democracy. In other cases in the West, calling for a deepening or a more participatory form of democracy. In all of these cases, you had broad populist slogans, right? The people in Egypt, the Indignados in Spain, the 99%. In the Occupy movement, and in each of these cases you had the mass occupation of public space, right? The importance of public space as a forum for political expression, the challenge to the privatization of public space. Within those spaces, you had the emergence of new and innovative direct mass forms of directly democratic decision-making and organizing, and also particularly key in all of these movements, unlike previous forms of social movements like the anti-globalization movement that I did research on in Spain and the US, you had many, many, many first-time movement participants. So what was happening is that these movements were very deeply penetrating social networks. And I think that had a lot to do with another characteristic, which was the prominent role of social media and the rise of what I talk about as a logic of aggregation. So the point is that because activists were using peer-to-peer networks to get the word out about these protests, they were able to sort of extend beyond typical activist networks. When you're sending tweets or posting Facebook messages to people who aren't just your activist friends, but your friends from diverse spheres of social life, family members, it's able to get the word out very rapidly and to break out of established kinds of political communities. And so I think that has a lot to do with explaining how these movements were able to arise so quickly, how they were able to bring together so many diverse people, and how they were able to get so many new people involved in protests. And so, I talk about this as a kind of logic of aggregation, the way that social media allow activists to generate messages that go viral very quickly, and that have the capacity to bring together or aggregate large numbers of people very quickly in physical spaces. And so I think that's a real advantage to the contemporary movements. But at the same time, and what might be interesting to think about, are some of the limitations of social media and these contemporary logics of aggregation. And to do that, it might be useful to compare the recent wave of movements with the prior wave of the anti-globalization movements, where activists were using new media in the internet, but new media from a kind of Web 1.0 generation, right? Listservs and websites. And these media were very good at allowing activists to build decentralized networks and to communicate across diversity and difference. The idea is that, horizontal collectives, informal networks have been around for a long, long time. But new media allow activists to organize this way at a much larger scale and much more quickly than they used to, right? You don't need bureaucratic organization to organize a national or global movement when you have new media and internet listservs and websites. And so you got the proliferation of a large number of decentralized networks that were at the core of these movements, and a logic that I talked about as a networking logic, which was really about the free flow of information and coordination across diversity and difference. Now, these movements had their own problems of sustainability, but you were able to more or less build sustainable networks based on the large counter-summit mobilizations against the IMF, the World Bank, the European Union, but then you would have networks that would sustain themselves over time. With the Occupy and the Indignado movements and the use of social media, you still have traditional sort of or Web 1.0 technologies, and you still have networks, but social media really come to the fore. And the logic here is, instead of building sort of sustainable networks over time, it's again the amassing of large numbers of individuals in physical spaces. So it's really, rather than the network of networks or the movement of movements that you saw with the anti-globalization movements, it's the crowd of individuals. Right, and that makes for a much larger movement, a much more diverse movement. But there are problems related to at least three factors. Right, you have problems of sustainability. Right, these movements are prone to disaggregate as quickly as they are to aggregate once the movements are evicted from public spaces or activists hire. Right, you also have problems of coordination when you have so many new activists coming together who don't share a common kind of activist background. It becomes difficult to maintain movement coordination beyond a certain point. And also, I think there are problems of sort of translation between these movements in the institutional political sphere. Again, you had that issue with the anti-globalization movements, but because you had more sustainable networks over time, including networks of NGOs, of research institutes, more political kinds of organizations, reformist networks, there was a greater level of I think, discussion and interpenetration between movement networks and official networks. With the contemporary Occupy and other movements, I think there's a much greater disconnect in some ways between the movements in the official political sphere. And so those were certainly issues in the United States, where once the Occupy movements were evicted, starting at the end of 2011 and into 2012, the movements really disappeared. I mean, you had other sorts of initiatives like networks around Hurricane Sandy, the Strike the Debt Network, or networks, anti-eviction networks, similar to some of the kinds of anti-eviction organizing you had in Spain, but by and large the Occupy movements weren't able to sustain themselves. Also in the US, you had serious problems of coordination, where the movement was great when it was new and people were excited, but it was very hard to come up with common processes and sort of common platforms. And so the movement really kind of disaggregated in part because of its own success. And then finally, you had a real inability for the Occupy movement to interact, I think, with the institutional political sphere, beyond shaping public discourse. Now, one of the interesting things is to compare that with what happened in Spain. And I'll leave that to the subsequent interventions to think more deeply about. But I think you also had problems of sustainability in Spain. But you had a much quicker turn back towards some of the neighborhood assemblies and sort of more traditional forms of neighborhood organizing in Spain. And you didn't really have that in the US. So I wonder if that speaks to some of the limitations of social media and the importance of combining social media organizing with traditional face-to-face organizing, and perhaps in places like Southern Europe and Spain with a much sort of thicker social network and a longer tradition of community kinds of organizing. Perhaps movements there are more able to deal with the sustainability issue. And the same thing goes for coordination. To the extent that the indignados or the Occupy movements or these mass occupations of public space can transition to more sustainable forms of organizing, it's perhaps easier to maintain ongoing coordination over time without kind of fragmentation. And then finally, the institutional political sphere. I think many activists in Spain are also skeptical, of course, of institutional politics. That was one of the reasons behind the critique of the movement. But at the same time, you had the emergence of a new party, Podemos, which in some ways reflects what was happening in Greece with Syriza, that at least for some sectors of the movement in Spain provided a framework for trying to transform institutional politics more broadly. So leaving the politics of street protest and taking similar kinds of critiques, logics, and practices and bringing them to bear within the institutional political context. In the US, that never happened, in part because of our two-party system and the difficulty of third parties, perhaps in part because you didn't have participation from such a wide swath of the population. But for whatever reason, once the Occupy movement kind of fizzled, you didn't really have an attempt to translate those innovations into an institutional political sphere. So I think I want to conclude by saying that social media really provide new forms of mobilizing, organization, and coordination that really help movements get off the ground, become large, diverse, and really make an impact in a much more significant and faster way than before, in part because of the ability of social media to generate messages and images and forms of expression that circulate virally, messages that penetrate the social fabric by moving through peer-to-peer social networks, right? And that make it possible to organize these movements in the absence of sort of traditional formal bureaucracies. But at the same time, social media, and this is more so than sort of the earlier kinds of listservs and websites, have some serious limitations, perhaps in terms of issues of sustainability, ongoing coordination over time, and the translation to more traditional political spheres. But it seems to me that in parts of the world, in places like Spain, where you have stronger traditional social networks, face-to-face social networks, traditions of civil society organizing and participation, that maybe it's easier to overcome some of those obstacles, and maybe that can help explain some of the differences. But I hope that some of my analysis can help spur discussion and debate, and perhaps that comparison between Occupy and the 15M movements can prove fruitful in terms of thinking about some of the strengths and limitations of social media organizing and its translation into street protest and ultimately into institutional politics, and how that can vary depending on very different social and political contexts.